have generously gone around. They've already passed out the PDH forms, so you should already have those. If you don't, please feel free to catch the issues over there, raising her hand right now, closest to the door. And she will be happy to provide that for you. Also, you see the evaluations that we've handed out for each of our speakers. There will be a box on the way out through the exit way that you can drop those in as you leave. So, I think I might actually lose the microphone too. Once everybody's sort of back. This is more natural to me. It feels like. So you'll have to excuse me a little bit. I was prepared for 2 hours, and we don't have 2 hours. So, but I'm immensely appreciative of Mr. Knapp and all the time that he took answering very specific questions, and that's exactly what we hope for. I'm also a big believer in Freirean pedagogy, which for those of you who haven't studied how to be a teacher, that means the notion that it's pedagogy of the oppressed. So it's the notion that your audience, the people who are in your class, know more about what they need to know than you do. So feel free, that's also my way of saying it was wonderful that you got the chance to talk with him. Please feel free to just ask me questions, shout them out, raise your hand, just like our other 2 speakers as we go along. Some of this will be a little bit of review from that, but hopefully as I'm pointing out here, I'm blending in a little bit of what we might think about as an EAP perspective with respect to marijuana. So I have this tabletop exercise here at the end. I kind of doubt we're going to get to that, but we'll see how that works. Hopefully, we'll be able to have our discussion in sort of a different kind of way. But in order to start the conversation, let's do a different little kind of exercise. So on whatever piece of paper you happen to have handy, I'm going to ask you to, for the next 3 statements that I'm going to put up here on the board, write down on a scale of 1 to 4 whether you agree more than disagree more than agree, or disagree with 4, 3, 2, 1 in each of these things, right? This sounds very clinical, right? Does this sound like somebody that talks to clients does? So just remember that, and I'll have a couple of statements up here so that we can sort of see where everybody's at and what the feeling is and perspective is in the room. And the scale's down here as well in case you need to see it again. All right. The fact that marijuana is legal for adults in Colorado is the largest substance abuse-related threat to employee health and workplace safety. Agree more than disagree more than agree, disagree. Everybody got it? Yeah. Okay. Without state laws prohibiting the sale and use of marijuana, EAPs are powerless to control its impact on workplaces. This may have been a little bit biased by the previous presenter. But in your own mind, you can consider where you thought you were before, when you came in the door this morning, versus where you are right now after hearing Lori and Mr. Knapp talk. Okay? Last one. The fact that Colorado is one of the first places in the world to have these types of marijuana laws means that substance abuse prevention efforts, which include EAPs and treatment providers, have no idea how to respond. This may not mean that you don't have any idea how to respond, but what is the gestalt of the field? Do we feel like we know how to respond? Everybody got it? Okay. Going back to the first one, the fact that marijuana is legal in Colorado is the largest substance abuse-related threat to employee health and workplace safety. Who said agree? 4. Nobody. Kind of surprised. All right. Agree more than disagree. 3. A couple of them. All right. Disagree more than agree. Okay. How about this absolute disagreement? Majority, absolute disagreement. If I were to guess, I would do this a little bit longer if we had longer time. But are prescription drugs a bigger area of concern? Yes. Generally feeling. What else? Alcohol. Okay. Alcohol, prescription drugs, the other legal substances. Right, so we're putting this within a conceptual framework of this is a legal substance, and maybe some of our confusion or the apprehension around it is that we haven't considered it as that before. right? So maybe this is something to think about and work from. How about without state laws prohibiting the sale and use, EAPs are powerless to control its impact on workplaces? Agreed? Vance told you what you need to do, right? Agree more than disagree? Disagree more than agree? Maybe there's a little bit. Okay, I see people who are kind of thinking about it, but they don't want to quite yet disagree. So there are maybe things that we can do to try to help control or mitigate impact on the workplace. All right. How about the fact that Colorado is one of the first places to have these laws means that we don't have any idea what we're doing or how to respond? Agreed. Nobody thinks so.
Well, state government doesn't know. I'll tell you that.
State government doesn't know. Okay.
But they don't know about a lot of things. This is one of them.
This is a new one they don't know.
This is on the list of things. How about agree more than disagree? A little bit of agreement there. Disagree more than agree. Okay? Disagree absolutely. We know what we're doing. That's reassuring. I like everyone's optimism about sort of the field itself. I think there's quite a bit of confusion actually. But part of that, at least within this process, is that because we haven't conceptualized it this way, like I was talking about before. And Governor Hickenlooper, and this was at a signing ceremony where he was giving the Department of Revenue authority to start building the Marijuana Enforcement Division, et cetera, said clearly we're charting new territory. Other states haven't been through this process. Recreational marijuana is a completely new entity, but really the bills we're signing today lay out this new territory. The governor recognizes this. A lot of people, the amount of conversation that we're having about it probably reflects some of this, this confusion or this apprehension. And I bet the answers that you guys gave are different than it'll be when we do this in other states. And I will be doing this in other states. When I did it in Illinois, everybody was worried. The picture of Colorado outside of Colorado is probably a little bit different than what we have here, where we don't live in igloos, for instance. That's one thing. Yeah.
Chris, I think the perspective on that survey is that as either EA people or EAP people or treatment people, that I think we have some awareness that the illegality or legality is not a direct correlation to whether it's a problem or not.
Right.
I think that's the perspective.
Right. We have that perspective, maybe because we're thinking about it like alcohol. We're used to thinking about it that way. Some of us are, some of us aren't. And maybe then we're also drawing this conceptual parallel, which we very intentionally did today with the topics that we covered, with prescription drugs, right? That are legal to use in certain circumstances, but then can still be impairment causing and can still cause issues within the workplace, right? And can still be the subject of employer policy. So, to give you an idea of where we are sort of nationally, people have probably seen this before, but what this highlights, I think, in sort of really good contrast, is that, of course, Colorado and Washington have legalized, fully legalized marijuana for adults. And then we have all of these states that have decriminalization of medical marijuana in one form or another. You could really look at this as a continuum, though, still of being restrictive versus being less restrictive. With less restrictive medical marijuana, especially policies and sort of the process, being represented by Colorado and California. In the more restrictive states, probably the most restrictive would be like Illinois and Maryland. Illinois just recently passed medical marijuana legislation, and how they're going to set it up, at least with respect to dispensaries, is that you have to have had your physician who you have to have a relationship with, so that you have to be able to establish that you've had a relationship with this person prior to going to get the recommendation for marijuana. But then also there's only going to be 60 dispensaries throughout the state. They're going to operate somewhat like package stores for anybody who's lived out east or in the Midwest, where they're all state-run, state-owned. They can place them essentially wherever they want them, and thereby not place them wherever they don't want them geographically, and can regulate their hours and how much they sell, etc. Very, very, very tightly controlled. In Maryland, in fact, it's even more tightly controlled. They don't actually have medical marijuana, but they have an exception for people who are in research studies that might be using marijuana as part of medical research. So they have to have had a condition that they then qualify for a research study, and then they can, then there's some kind of treatment with that as far as from a legal standpoint. Now, of course, that still doesn't impact drug-free workplace policy. But what this highlights a little bit of is how important the work and the conversations that we're having in Colorado are, because we're likely to be followed nationally, and then, incidentally, internationally. Right? So this gives you an even broader idea of just sort of how alone in the world we are right now with what we're doing. So of course I've circled Colorado and Washington as being places that have fully legalized marijuana. And we kind of tend to think sometimes that, oh, well, why can't we just figure out what the Netherlands did, is usually the one that we think of, right? But what we've done is we've tried to sort of create a system that does a lot, right? We're trying to regulate cultivation, we're trying to regulate distribution, we're trying to regulate sales and use among adults. We're making it available to people who live outside the state, albeit in more limited quantities. And yeah, I mean, those are sort of the biggest things. So some differences. Washington, I think you're hearing my argument that we actually have the most permissive marijuana policies in the entire world, and here's where I'm coming from. Washington has a lot of the similar legislation that we do, but we wrote it into our state constitution. They did not. So for us to overturn it, we would have to have a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly of the state. 2/3 vote, right? Their state legislature could come together and by simple majority get rid of the law if they really wanted to. Now it's not likely to happen, probably won't, but it could. I'll go down to Uruguay here, actually, which is the more recent addition to this list. This map is on Wikimedia Commons, by the way. It's excellent. In Uruguay, actually legalized the production, cultivation, distribution, sale to adults of marijuana, made it legal to use in sort of broad open daylight in public, which is a little bit more or a little bit less restrictive than what we have here in Colorado. But they aren't allowing state to non-Uruguayan nationals. Okay? So they want to discourage pot tourism. They want to discourage people from going there for the express purpose of using marijuana legally. We have not done that. Instead of in Colorado, where adults can buy up to an ounce of marijuana at a time, people with out-of-state or out-of-country IDs, but who can still illustrate how old they are, can only buy up to 1/8 of an ounce, but you still can. And you can still use it, provided that you do it on private property with the property owner's consent. So I think we're a little bit more permissive in that respect too, and we're trying to make it a business. Moving over here, actually to Bangladesh. It's hard to find what the laws in Bangladesh are. It doesn't really seem like there's a real effort to legalize cultivation or try to regulate it in any way. It's just sort of allowed for religious observance. And people grow their own, generally speaking, and can use it for religious purposes, but that definition has become so broad that it's just sort of practically not enforced. I think if I were making this map, I'd make it more like India right next door, because it sort of seems like there are laws, but they're not enforced kind of thing. Any geography majors out there?
North Korea.
That is North Korea.
Oh my God.
Dictator. The little T-5 dictator in North Korea. And it's again difficult to figure out what North Korean laws are, but people who have escaped or people who've gone on humanitarian missions and things like that have come back and said, and there was a really interesting interview with people in the Huffington Post, which are in the notes section of this slide, if you go online and find them on the EPA's website, who said if there are laws, and we don't know, they're totally not enforced. People, especially people in the lower socioeconomic classes, it's the booze. It's the thing that you do when you go home and you're blowing off steam after work. So, are there laws? We don't know. If they are, they're totally not enforced. Or Kim Jong-un just plain old doesn't care.
No wonder where I've been with him.
And that may be the case. All right. So then the one that we always think about, right? The Netherlands. You go to Amsterdam and you go to the coffee shop, right? It's a coffee shop. And of course you can buy coffee there, but you can also buy marijuana there. And we think sort of logically that, well, they've done this, so why can't we do that too? No. They didn't try to regulate cultivation. They didn't try to regulate distribution. They didn't try to do any of that. In fact, cultivation and distribution are still illegal in the Netherlands. So you can buy marijuana at these shops, but it has to get there by some magical process. It just sort of shows up there, and then they sell it. So they haven't attempted to make a true business out of it like we are here. So we're doing a lot that the rest of the world really isn't doing. And it seems logical that some of the decisions that we make are going to inform what the rest of the world does as legalization and decriminalization progresses. Yeah?
Is Washington doing what we're doing?
Washington? Washington, by and large, is doing what we're doing. And we're sort of, in some ways, doing what Washington's doing. Now, we can say that we did it first because the polls closed an hour earlier, but the thing that they did before we did, and maybe we'll come into this later on, is they attempted to set up the DUI marijuana structure earlier than we did. We were trying to figure out what are we going to consider, how much is too much for driving purposes. And they set that 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood threshold, and Mr. Knapp very nicely went over it, that it's not a per se standard, and you could still argue in court if you weren't impaired, etc. But they set that standard first, and then I think we just sort of picked it up as we went along. Other questions or comments? Look at how much red there is in the rest of the world, right? Yeah.
Well, it's still the 5 nanograms.
Yeah.
It still requires that if a cop stops somebody and you have a suspicion you're under the influence, you're impaired while you're driving while smoking marijuana or taking THC, then we have to ship you out to a hospital, right? I mean, we don't take the blood right at roadside.
They don't do it roadside. It would have to follow existing protocols for law enforcement with respect to obtaining blood samples. So they can require you to go to the police department and submit to a test there for blood. Because we do have implied assent, just like we do with alcohol, where if you're operating a motor vehicle, you've given your implicit assent to those searches, and if you're asked to do that and you refuse to, that can be considered sort of a positive in that way, just like we do with alcohol. What's that?
And then you lose your license?
And then you lose your license, or you go to court, or whatever. I don't know what necessarily what it would be at that point. But they can physically coerce somebody to give a blood test if they're investigating vehicular homicide or vehicular assault. So if you actually killed somebody or were using your car as a weapon, and that's what they're investigating, then they can do that. If it's for swerving while driving or driving on the wrong side of the road, etc., then they can't use physical coercion, but there still is that implied assent. Yeah, Rachel.
Can you speak to it all what went into the decision for the 5 nanogram cutoff?
Let's go. All right. The conventional wisdom, and of course I don't know necessarily what all was on the table when that was decided. As I said before, you could think cynically, like Washington said 5 nanograms, so we said 5 nanograms. Now, why did Washington say 5 nanograms? We don't really know. And why they specify blood tests as opposed to urine tests, which are sort of more common, a little bit less invasive. It feels a little different than blood to a lot of people, and especially for the purposes of not for DUI, but for workplace or other types of testing. It's very challenging to see where that particular level of active THC corresponds to any level of impairment or any level of something else. Now, there are some studies, and this is mirroring a lot of the stuff that we've heard before, that we just kind of don't know a lot about marijuana and what it does to the body and what it does over long periods of time with respect to cognitive or physical performance. But we know that it does at increasing levels, it does increase the risk of motor vehicle accident, which is where some of the studies would be. But what that does, per person is a little bit different, a little bit challenging. And this is where we haven't borrowed necessarily the allegory of alcohol, and that makes it a little bit challenging. So just like Vance said, somebody could be ticketed for that. And he said the argument's likely to be that somebody's tolerance is really high, and I suppose that's possible. But I think that it's just as likely that somebody's going to say, that this stuck around in their body for a long period of time, as we know it can, although that's less true for blood than it is for urine. And that